Welcome back, Cal listeners. This is Methodical Millions, where you can better your future and better yourself. Cal, we've got another awesome guest with us today. So everyone listening, please welcome Michael Ippolito, all the way from Brooklyn. Michael, how's it going?
Going very well. Thanks for the moniker of awesome. I will do my best to live up to it.
Of course, I wouldn't expect anything less. So I want to start with a question. What gets you excited about life?
Yeah, I think overall, if you trace, the trajectory of my life, I think intellectual curiosity is always something that has excited me quite a bit. I just love really exploring ideas. I was a huge nerd in high school. I was, as a classics major, so I translated like Latin and ancient Greek, and I was captain of my debate team. So really love to explore big ideas, debate ideas, and that's kind of carried through to what I'm doing now. So just like 10-second background on me, I'm the co-founder of a media company called Blockworks, and we kind of translate what's going on in crypto to a subset of more traditional investors and financial services professionals. And like the connection between classics and psych and what I'm doing now is I just love exploring like big ideas, looking at the world, and kind of approaching it through the lens of history. I guess that's my super nerd answer for you.
Dude, that's amazing. I actually just bought a Latin English dictionary off eBay. So I've got this
Nice.
little office upstairs I bought off a coworker. It's actually for my Airbnb, and it's my first real office because you feel like, $1 million man with this like crazy high-end stuff. And, I just went on this like, I've been buying so many cool books that I like, and within budget, of course. I don't want to go crazy, but
Mm.
no, I always wanted to learn. So was that difficult? Is it hard as people say it is?
Latin is manageable. Ancient Greek is as it is as hard as it would you would assume that it is, because Latin at least has the same alphabet. Greek is a completely different alphabet, and because it's an older language tends to get more efficient as it evolves. So Latin is like heavily based on ancient Greek, but a lot of the inefficiencies have been kind of combed through and ironed out. Ancient Greek is like it's a tough language, man, because it's a totally different alphabet, and they're like all these irregular kind of participles, but it's cool. I mean, my favorite part about it is like I actually really like the translation because it's almost like you're solving a puzzle. It's actually quite analytical. Actually, I think Latin actually kind of rhymes with math in general. But my favorite part about translating this stuff was, you'll be translating something from 2,000 years ago, and it's completely 100% applicable to today. So one of my favorite authors from back there is this guy named Aristophanes. So he was one of the famous comic playwrights back in ancient Greece. And if you were to translate this stuff, some of it would feel pretty dense. It's like very old language and different scenarios, but actually the satire is really, really good. It actually reminds me of almost South Park a little bit in a way, in the way that they kind of lambast and make fun of the current politicians of the day. But there are these just cool anecdotes which just remind you that humanity doesn't really change at all, even 2,500 years ago. So there's this really cool anecdote about there's this older person in the play, and they're making fun of the youthful generation, right? Like, we fought in this war, and this new entitled generation, they have no idea what real struggle is like. All they want to do is hang around and play dice, and you could like,
No way.
yeah, man, I'm telling you, you could superimpose that on today, right? And all these older people being like, oh, we had it so hard when we were kids, we're walking up, I walk to school uphill both ways in the rain and snow, right? And all these kids just want to play their video games. It's just a cool reminder that nothing really changes.
That's awesome. You almost have to memify the old books and put it on Twitter. I think there'd be a huge account if you did that.
Yeah, I think so too. If anyone cracks the code for how to translate ancient comedy and drama into Twitter, yeah, I think they'd blow right up. But it's probably beyond my intellectual capabilities.
Yeah. So what was it that took you from? I love when you say you're curious about things, because I believe that's one of my mantras too. And I find that, it gives you an openness, and you also there's no like pretext of what you have to do, right? You kind of explore and you kind of try things, right? So what was that journey like from studying, those ancient texts? Did you have any cool side projects after that?
Yeah, I think so. I when I was in school, I focused on two things. So I did, kind of translation of a lot of these ancient texts, and that's just cool because it gives you kind of a window into different cultures and empires throughout history. I also was a double major in psychology as well, so I focused on a lot of like specifically neuropsych as well, and just figuring out how the brain works and everything. Because I was always just very interested in how people make decisions. And neuropsych kind of takes you down a little bit of a weird rabbit hole. You start to question like, oh, how people behave in large groups, and how individual incentives bump up against large group incentives. And then also just, questions of free will in general. And you're like, is the human brain actually structured in such a way that free will makes a whole lot of sense, or does it not? But to translate that into how, like, what I'm doing, right now, one of the things that I never in a million years thought I would be interested in, but am super interested in, is actually how finance works. Because if you read historical text, the lens that they show you the world is through politics. This great person, this king or this ruler or this general or whatever did this, and that's why it all happened. And when you're reading it, at least when I read this stuff in school, I was like, oh, these people make these decisions, and it's because of their character, their will, or the values of the nation. That's how it gets written down. But then it turns out there's an economic lens and a financial lens that drives things. And even when you look at some of the conflict in our world today, I'm looking at things much more through the lens of finance, and the economic incentives of different nations, right? So I think it's really interesting me to figure out a little bit about how finance worked and how it influences human decision making on a nation scale or a macro or global scale. So I think the introduction of finance and economics incentives was a huge inflection point for me in just how I think about humanity and the evolution of the world.
And would you say, it's a very astute point, I think, and you know, given what's going on, we had Russia invading Ukraine today. Not to get too political, but it's a real thing, right? And I always hear of like, kingdoms. Is it either a necessity or is it a want? So, like, do you think countries or kingdoms would invade just because they could?
I think it's probably some combination of both, right? But I mean, if you want to use an analogy to kind of literature in general, I think it probably happens more so the way, like, if you look at genres of fiction and fantasy, you've got kind of the Lord of the Rings type world, and then you've got the Game of Thrones type world. And I would argue, and don't read too much into this, but we're more in the Game of Thrones type world. And what I mean by that is, in Lord of the Rings, it's very much a battle between good and evil, right? And I think there are certainly merits to that. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Lord of the Rings, Battle of Helm's Deep, one of the all-time fight scenes in a movie in general. But I thought Game of Thrones was really interesting because you saw kind of the underlying power structures that determine things, and you would see how these different great houses, with their economic incentives, they would kind of rouse up the people and get these narratives going. But really, what was driving things was, there were financial means that were kind of driving everything. So, I don't want to comment too heavily on the Ukraine-Russia situation. I'll just say that I think it's quite sad, what's going on, and my heart goes out to the folks that are in, the Ukrainians. But this is a story of, in my opinion, geopolitical struggle, right? So, Putin has in the past pushed back on NATO incursions into, geographically close places like Georgia, right? So this is kind of one of those weird examples of, he views it as a overstepping by Western forces, NATO forces, whatever. And it's kind of portrayed in the Western media as, oh, this is some megalomaniacal figure, and he's just doing this because of his ego. Maybe part of that is true. I don't know. I don't have a personal relationship with Putin, but I think, if China was suddenly buying up like large swaths of Canada and, right next to the US border, I think we'd also have a pretty weird view of it, right? Be like, why are you trying to do that? So I think there's a lot of, different incentives at play here. And I'm not a military strategist or geopolitical strategist, so I don't want to comment, but I also think there's probably a lot going on beneath the surface and a lot of different viewpoints that are floating around out there.
Yeah, I gotta agree with you. I do actually work. My day job is involved quite heavily in the financial markets,
Mm.
and whether I actually don't have much interest in political events, but with the job that I do, I have to know what's happening because, like you mentioned, there's always some sort of motive or incentive or effect that happens to these financial instruments and markets that have around the world. So there's always things that you can see that's happening. For example, again, not to necessarily to comment on what's happening right now, but the effects on energy prices right now, obviously with oil and gas and what's happening and how other countries are reacting in terms of supply of that and how they're trying to get the price of oil down right now. Obviously it's breaking new highs, broke $100 today. So that's been 8 years since it reached this level. So just in terms of perspective, I have a similar view of the financial markets to you. I did study accounting and finance in university. I didn't really get it. I did enjoy finance, but not until I got into it that it really started to make a lot of sense. And seeing how everything is related to each other and how things are affected by each other, that really made it quite interesting for me. Even when it comes to, for example, something new like crypto, the crypto market. Some people might see it as an opportunity. Some people will see it as a big risk with a lot of sanctions that are happening. I personally see it as a big buying opportunity, but there's the other thing of a liquidity shortage right now. So with the US dollar and other currencies globally, with central banks are doing in terms of quantitative tightening and things like that. So, just to see how things really are panning out, it really is quite interesting. And why don't you tell us more about how did that really dial into what you're doing in terms of your interest into finance and economics?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just have a curiosity in terms of how things work in general, like what is making people really tick in terms of how decisions get made. Crypto is a super interesting one. I also, I'm biased. I'm definitely supportive of the asset class and the industry. But it's really interesting just in terms of how it bumps up into different countries' incentives. So you have crypto, and my overall viewpoint for crypto is that it is a pushback against an overreach in terms of centralization that's happened across a whole bunch of different institutions, right? So I think you have one of the, unfortunately, hallmarks of the current day is a lack of trust in institutions across a whole different breadth of different types of, right? You've got lack of trust in government. You've got a lack of trust in education. You've got a lack of trust in healthcare, media, the financial system in general. And I think what crypto basically says is we want to abstract away the need for trust in other humans. That's what Bitcoin basically was, right? It got started in 2009. It was a direct response to the great financial crisis where, banks essentially abused the trust of the public. And, we ended up having to bail them out. A lot of people rightly kind of pointed them and said, hey guys, this was a huge overreach. We might need another system here. And so Bitcoin is basically a direct reaction to that. Is that we don't want to actually rely on these financial intermediaries because we view it as a point of weakness and not a point of strength in the system. And now, as you're starting to see other parts of crypto take shape, I think there are other trusted, previously trusted intermediaries that crypto is pushing back on. So if you look at a lot of what's going on with this whole narrative of like the metaverse and Ethereum and Web3, I think the way that I understand that is it's a pushback against social media platforms, which have gotten too large and powerful in general. And now they're starting to deplatform people. That's all very bullish for crypto. So, you're starting to see, crypto as an industry. I don't know. I think it splits you. And honestly, sometimes I actually waffle back and forth as well. I think you could view it through an optimistic lens and say a lot of the institutions that exist right now are no longer serving their constituents in the way that they're supposed to. And therefore, crypto is very optimistic because this actually represents a better way. And it's actually kind of a groundswell retail grassroots driven movement for the most part, right? So it's kind of cool. It's like people taking power back into their own hands. I think the more pessimistic way of looking at it would be to say, ooh, when you look at periods of transition in history where institutions crumble and then reform, that's all very well and good. That's nature healing, but those transition points tend to be pretty chaotic, right? And and not necessarily periods of time that you want to live through. But overall, I see, operating in crypto on a day-to-day basis, I see a tremendous amount of human capital pouring into the space and a tremendous amount of optimism about the future and all that kind of good stuff. But to the point of how crypto kind of bumps up against economic incentives in nations, the U.S. is a really, really interesting example of this. So if you were to say, what is the business model of the United States? I would characterize that as the US. We've got, the largest and deepest capital markets in the world. And the reason is because we have strong property rights and we encourage innovation. So basically what the US says is, hey, all you entrepreneurs in the world, we want you to come to the US. Entrepreneurs in the US, we want to encourage you to build things and you can share in the upside, right? So we want to encourage innovation, company building locally, but then we want to tax you, make sure we get a cut of it. From that perspective, crypto really belongs in the US. It's exactly that nature. It's very, very free market focused, building and creating value. From that perspective, if you're in the US, you're thinking, ooh, I actually want to encourage entrepreneurs in crypto to build here, right? And then I'll just make sure I take my cut of it. We'll be the leader in this new industry. The other set of incentives, though, is that the US has a tremendous amount of privilege being the issuer of the global reserve currency, right? So we, the world, like 86% of trade or something like that, around that, don't quote me exactly, is denominated in US dollars. It's a tremendous privilege, right? Because we're the issue of those dollars and we have a lot of control, right? So you can see this in the form of like sanctions and things like that. Also, we basically get cheap financing from the rest of the world because they have to buy our dollars. So crypto, and Bitcoin in particular, but honestly, I think the whole industry, crypto, is kind of a pushback on that and saying, actually, we are no longer sure that that's the best system. So on the one hand, you have kind of the political establishment in DC, and that's Treasury, being like, hey, we really like being the issuer of the reserve currency. Crypto is a direct threat to that. So we don't really like that. But then from the economic interest of the United States and maybe taking a longer term view of the next 20 or 30 years, you might say, well, this industry is going to succeed one way or the other. We might as well encourage it to happen here. And that way we can at least profit from it. So there are these very like funny incentives bumping up against one another. And I think that's where you see some of this almost like double speak, right? You've got some politicians, are pro crypto, some politicians are against. You've got, a CFTC, which is one of the regulatory bodies in the US, which is very pro, and SEC, which looks a little bit against, but there's the ties between SEC and Treasury are much stronger, right? So I've kind of heard, again, this is rumors, I wouldn't take it to the bank, but that a lot of the increased regulatory pressure you see is actually coming from Treasury, and that's why it's focused on stable coins. So yeah, I just, I think we're at a really interesting kind of inflection point for crypto in general as an industry, and probably more broadly the world. That was a bit of a ramble.
No, not at all. Yeah, it's hard to really place, politics. I'm not a huge, fan of it myself. And, you talk about things like double speak and, how often do you hear of short sellers, talking poorly about companies or, people always talk up their bags as the saying goes. So, you always wonder, like, as you said, like, you hear of like Goldman Sachs saying, yeah, crypto's not real. And then a week later they buy some. So, I mean, saying is one thing and then following the money is the other. So, thankfully with, blockchain, you can follow the money and you can see where it's going if you want to, spend hours doing that. And, what brought me to tech in the first place, just to give you an idea, was that it was merit based. It wasn't like, hey, where did you go to school? And, that whole US innovation thing really resonates with me too, because it's the love of creating. And, I always find that entrepreneurship was this like subset of cool things that you could get an outsized return, but you also didn't have to, deal with as much prejudice or, being born the right way. So, I mean, all good points. And do you find that, as you mentioned with Web3, so how early are we when it comes to, I'm going to say it, but NFTs and, a lot of people are building communities and discords, staking. What are your thoughts on that kind of stuff?
I think when it comes to crypto, the risk is that we're actually too early instead of being too late. So I'll kind of contextualize what I mean by that. I think if you've paid attention to crypto, a lot of the world that kind of periodically pays attention to crypto whenever it's going up, basically, and then they stop paying attention as soon as it goes down. But it's very common for people to think that they kind of missed the boat. And that's because of astronomical returns that have happened in some of the large assets that you've heard of, like Bitcoin or Ethereum. It's up, I don't even know, Bitcoin went from whatever it was like sub $1 to whatever it's trading at today, around 35,000, high of 69,000. So it's very natural to look at that and say, I might have missed the boat there. But, if you look at the history of the internet, people tend to start that history in the late 90s, right around the time that the dot-com bubble was inflating. But really, the network was born out of experiments from DARPA, right? And that was happening in the late 60s, early 70s. So if you start the timeline there, it was a really, really long time before significant, impactful businesses were actually built on the internet. I don't think that's going to happen. I think you already have meaningful businesses that have been built in crypto. You have an asset class that was at one point worth over $3 trillion. It's like 1.5 trillion today. So I think we're further along than 1970s, 1980s internet, but there are still a lot of risks and headwinds, right, that crypto is facing. I think the biggest existential risk in general is kind of about that there's two different sets of incentives that the US has. So China's essentially come out and said, we don't like crypto, right? And I think my personal reason for that is it's kind of ideologically opposed to crypto. Crypto says this is permissionless, this is decentralized, you can opt into this system, lack of intermediaries. China is all about control ideologically, and specifically the way their economy is set up, they do not allow for the free flow of capital. And a huge part of crypto is the free flow of capital on a global scale. So China, it's basically said we don't like this. This isn't great. The next, the other large market here, right? There are obviously multiple markets, but the US is where a lot of this is going to live or die, I think. So the US has a big decision to make of whether or not they're going to embrace it, or they could put draconian regulations on it and say, we want no part of this. And I think if the US did that, they wouldn't succeed on making it go away entirely, but they would put a huge dent in the industry, right? And maybe push off growth for 10 or 20 years, right? In like kind of a worst case scenario. So that when I say that the risk is that we're actually too early, is that something like that happens, like an existential crisis for crypto, and that there's, it's relatively subdued as an industry or artificially suppressed for like 20 years or something like that. But in terms of NFTs, DAOs, even just Bitcoin adoption in general, I think it'd be really hard to look at it and say that we're anything but early in general. It's like a really, really small amount of people in the world still own Bitcoin, and then a much smaller percentage than that own NFTs. And if this technology does end up working and becoming pervasive, the market size for it is just as large as the internet. So, I would say it's still, happy to get into specifics, but I think it's still super early days across the board.
Yeah, I agree with you because, I've always heard the sentiment of, Amazon is a 30-year-old company, but, it only became big in the last 5, 10, 15 years. And there's a lot of, like you said, building in the space, and where's all the talent going, and where do people want to work? So, the fact that there is this democratization of ideas, which is why I love entrepreneurship. I think as long as like US, Canada, by extension, or any, country really allows for that, I think it can thrive. And that's where you see the two worlds collide of politics and tech, which is really, trying to, Pandora's box is open with crypto. It's not, I don't think it is going away. And, it just comes down to, I think regulation can only slow adoption. It's not going to totally kill it.
Yeah. And, everything outside of real draconian regulation actually speeds up the adoption of crypto, because one of the things that's been hampering the growth of crypto in general is that we just haven't gotten clear regulatory guidance from, I'm not picking on the SEC here. It's kind of the SEC in the US, the FCA in the UK, and whatever regulatory, bodies in other countries. But, regulators have struggled to kind of provide clear guidelines for good faith actors, people that just want to operate within the bounds of the law in their given jurisdictions. And I'm actually not picking on the regulators here. I think it's really difficult, right? They're not set up to craft an entirely new set of rules for one industry, right? They've also got a set number of staff. They're all working and doing their best. So I think it's just been a really, this is how these things tend to happen. There's going to be a lot of friction. It's going to take longer than all the technologists want, right? People are going to scream, why are you, hampering innovation and growth and opportunity? But ultimately, at the end of the day, there's a reason that we have regulators. Bad things do happen. There are bad faith actors. There are hacks that cost people hundreds of millions of dollars, right? These happen in crypto. So I think overall, regulation is something that we need, and it's a good thing. We just want to make sure that we're doing it in the right way.
To be honest, you beat me to it. I was just going to say the same thing. Basically, the idea, the fact that if it was regulated, I think it will be more appealing to a lot of those people who are still not yet into crypto, knowing that it has regulation, that it's basically by having it regulated, it would be effectively approved by, let's say, forces that be. Or I know technically there's a decentralization aspect of cryptocurrency, but there's a lot of people out there that think that this is all speculation. This is obviously there's aspects of that, but I mean, in the sense that once a government comes in, or a government entity or a regulator comes in and puts those regulations in place, you have these large institutions getting and adopting cryptocurrency. And as it grows and there's a way for people to understand it a bit more, I think that will really clear and maybe increase adoption as well. So talking about crypto now, do you want to talk more about Blockworks?
Yeah, sure. So I'll thank you for letting me shamelessly plug Blockworks. Blockworks. So
Not a go ahead.
we're Blockworks is a financial media brand. It was kind of based on two ideas. One, Jason's my co-founder. When we started it in 2017, there were like 50,000 people in crypto. We thought over the course of the next 10 years, there's going to be a billion people that either are operating in the space or own crypto in some way. So when you have growth like that, in general, you need there's a huge demand and a premium to be paid on good media services, right, around that space, because there's a lot of eyeballs and attention and capital and complexity in the space. There's a lot of value in synthesizing that information, building a brand that people can trust, and just communicating what's going on. So, I think step one, if you almost look at the basic infrastructure building blocks of media, like the most basic thing is you just need editorial brands that people trust, right? It's like, if this brand says this thing, then I can take it to the bank. I know that it's true. You also need things like conferences. It's like, okay, I'm interested in this space. I want to meet people. I want to know that it's not all just ICO shillers and, whatever your stereotype is, drug money, terrorists or whatever. You want to actually meet good people in the space. You want long form interviews, right? Which are like, okay, I get that this is happening and this is news, but like, help me understand this big idea. So that's what Blockworks has really been building. We've been building this big community of people that are engaged in the space. We host conferences, podcasts, newsletters. We report on the space, you name it. So, we've been building, one of the fastest growing and largest media brands in crypto overall. And from again, just my own interest, based on this podcast, I love my job because, a lot of what I do is I just talk to these really smart people that are building things. And one of my favorite things is when they make me think of things in a different way, or I learn something, or they change my mind and make me think about it in a way that I hadn't thought about it before. I think that is just so cool. And that, to answer the question that you didn't ask, that is what gets me up in the morning. That's what I really love doing.
100%. It's such a cool endeavor. And, just browsing on, blockworks.co, what a phenomenal website. It looks really, really cool.
Thanks.
Very well laid out and a lot of good info. I think you're right. The space is super early because, the first thing people think of is, it's a scam, or, people are going to lose their money. They think of the pump and dumps. They see that one, news, like bad news sells, right? So whenever the market tanks or someone loses money, you're going to hear about it. And I think when it comes to news, it's great you had mentioned things like a trusted source. So do you think we'll ever see, a trustless news site? Is that concept even possible in terms of like non-centralized place to get media?
It's tough, right? I mean, even in crypto, you can't abstract away humanity entirely. At the end of the day, whether, even though we're relying more on algorithms than we ever have before, someone designs the algorithms, right? And I'm not really sure that we want to 100% abstract away all human involvement and trust in general. What separates us evolutionarily from the rest of the inhabitants on Earth is that humanity is really good at coordinating, right? If you look at other animals, like lions kind of coordinate on the hunt, chimpanzees and other apes are pretty good at coordinating, and they live in these kind of societies. But humanity is like really, really good at communication, coordination. I think the idea of putting checks and balances and guardrails, technology that kind of provides some guardrails for humanity to exist, is a good idea. But at the end of the day, humanity's all we have is each other, man. That's all we've got, really, at the end of the day. So I think for media in general, we're in a bit of a weird environment where there's a huge lack of trust in institutions in general. But I'm not sure really what a decentralized media would look like. At the end of the day, humans want to hear from other humans. People care about storytelling and narrative. So I think that the media has some work to do to regain the trust, probably of society writ large. But overall, I don't see the model as being broken. And in fact, I think it's going to become more and more important over the course of the next, let's say, 50 years or so. I listened to this podcast with Eric Schmidt. I don't know if you guys know him from Google, but he's super into AI. You should listen to this. He's Tim Ferriss interview. I think he did it like a year ago. But he said one of the things, he really scary. he's talking about quantum computing, generalized AI. He thinks these are coming within the next 20 years. And he says one of the biggest problems that's going to come from that is we're going to be awash with fake information. So you've already probably seen these deep fakes online, right? But if you kind of join these two trends of lack of trust in the media and AI that can basically make anyone say anything with 100% fidelity, it's a really weird environment where people just don't know what's real and what to trust. So I think at the end of the day, the need for media has never been greater. And I think humans are always going to have a huge part in that. But I think, we probably have some work to do to just regain people's trust in general.
Well, there you go. You almost have to publicize your articles on the blockchain so people know it comes from you, right?
That's right.
And yeah, it is an interesting time because you hear of things like misinformation and online tech warfare and all this kind of stuff. The deep fakes are crazy because I think a lot of people do them in terms of memes, right? But it gets the point across that it looks like this person said this or did this, and it really isn't true. So, what makes truth so important? As a studier of Latin and Greek, why should people believe in truth?
Someone asked me this question a while ago. Like, why do promises matter? Promises matter because if you don't trust one another, then society can't function on like a super basic level, right? So if you think about what humans need to survive and thrive, let's think about it through a financial lens, right? You need to perform transactions, right? Basic trade, like I give you corn, you give me back cattle, whatever. I know that doesn't apply to us in normal life, but how people get food. If there's no element of trust there, then those transactions can't really happen on a large scale. So the idea of, the idea of trust actually comes from truth. Like if we have the shared idea of what society is and what values are important, etc., then I can trust you because I know you believe in this and I believe in this, and it all kind of flows down from one thing. And I think one of the things that's a little bit concerning, just looking out into the world today, is that you actually have it's like two different realities. Let's use the example of America right now, which people will probably be familiar with. I think if you talk to people on the coasts, they would have a very different perception of literally truth and reality in the world than people in middle America. I think another way that you could slice it up is, say, if you talk to people of a certain generation, like, not to be it, but the older generation, I think, is a very different view of reality and what is true than the younger generation. And part of that is variety, and part of that is healthy. You want different viewpoints to kind of propagate. But I think the degree to which it seems to be happening right now is problematic. And with the two sets of truth that exist in the world, it's just become harder and harder to trust each other, I think. And it seems like, across a whole bunch of different dimensions on media or the political spectrums or whatever, humans are not approaching each other from the perspective of, I assume good intentions. People aren't assuming good intentions with each other right now when they interact. And I think it's a problem, but I'm optimistic. I think that we can fix it. I think that we can resolve those issues. We just everyone needs to get on the same page. We all need to start rowing in the same direction. I don't really know how we're going to do that, but as long as everyone can see that, like, a relatively similar idea of what's true and right, we can start trusting each other again, rowing the boat in the same direction. Nothing is insurmountable, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I always find it like I guess I'll pose the question: if everyone's rowing the same boat, do you have room for innovation? What about the person who wants to row a different way or maybe work on something different? So there's almost like this fine line of, hey, don't screw up in society. You got to live sustainably. But then, I really do embrace the idea, like yourself, working on different projects or following that curiosity. So how do you mix or mesh that, synchronicity with everyone getting along and the whole curiosity about the world?
I guess the way I would answer that is, I think everything exists on a spectrum, right? You obviously don't want everyone 100% aligned on the same thing, because that looks like an authoritarian state. But you also can't have everyone sprinting off in a whole bunch of different directions, because then nothing ever gets done. The truth, it's a little bit frustrating to say, but it's always like somewhere in the middle, isn't it? And I think it depends on the scale of the enterprise that you're trying to orchestrate. So, give you an example. When you are in a startup, everyone needs to be 100% aligned. Every single hire is critical. You almost just don't want even like one grain out of place. So actually, it's funny. Like one of the biggest misperceptions about startups, really early stage startups, is like you can do anything I want. We hired a lot of people, and a lot of people come in and they're like, I want to do this and this and this. And it's like, actually, we have to be really, really focused on our mission, because if everyone isn't aligned, marching to the same beat and trying to get to the same place, then we aren't going to get anything done. And startups is hard, right? Like everyone has to be kind of doing the same thing. So I think for smaller organizations like that, you actually need a really aligned set of perspectives and a viewpoint, shared mission, etc. I think as you get larger, like really large companies or countries, and those countries and large companies are very different, but for larger organizations, I think what you still need is that same set of shared values. So, in a company, we'd call that culture. I guess in nations, you call it culture too. But you need this similar set of shared values, and you need an overall mission statement or framework for like, what's the goal here? What are we trying to do? What do we think is right? What do we think is good? What do we think is bad? And then within that loose framework, you want a diverse set of opinions, right? And you want people to be free enough to say, actually, I get that this is the mission and what we're trying to do, but I think this is the better way to get there. That's really quite healthy. Obviously, what you don't want is really, really large like nation states, and they say, hey, this is the mission, and by the way, this is how we're going to get there. I'm going to tell you exactly how to do it, because that's just too much power in the hands of a small set of people. So just like anything else in life, I just think it's a balance.
Right on. It makes sense. And, would you say that, is there any other key insights you have besides being on the same track when it comes to startups? Like, when would you make your first hire?
I'm not sure that there's any one playbook for startups. Jason, so Blockworks has a pretty atypical story, because we didn't really take outside capital from investors. So, I think in the beginning, Jason and I were super, super diligent about only hiring when we absolutely needed to, and being really deliberate about those hires. And I think that's a pro and a con, because on the one hand, we really, really took our time. We were really, really insistent that everyone that came onto Blockworks, A, was contributing value, but B, kind of fit into our culture. So I think one of the things that's come out of that situation is I am just so, so proud of the culture that we have and the employees that we've hired. Seriously, I'm like really, really thankful every day that I get to work with them. I guess on the other hand, we probably didn't grow as fast as we could have, especially in the beginning, because if we'd had even like a little bit more capital, then it just would have made growing quickly probably that much easier. So I'm not really sure there's any one way. And also your hires really depend on the type of business that you're in. So we're a media company, so we need a couple things. We need content and we need really good execution. But if you're a tech platform, what you end up needing is like a really good CTO, right? Or a developer to build that out. Now we see ourselves as an information platform today. So the developer and tech side is starting to come in, but we didn't need it in the beginning. So it really just all depends on the type of company that you're building.
Right on. And how long has Blockworks been around exactly?
Well, Blockworks was in the beginning, it was just me and Jason, and we were doing it as a side hustle before it became our main hustle. So we actually incorporated in December of 2017, and then we both went full time with it in May of 2018.
That's awesome. Right, for the great crypto winter, as people call it, right? Where you go
Yeah,
from anything's possible to the world's falling. How do
I think
you
we called the
Yeah, go
top by
ahead.
like 1 month. When we first incorporated.
Yeah. So how do you, let's talk about your mission and, in the worst of days, what makes you persist? Why is it important to keep building? And, does that compound? What kind of advice can you give people who are working on these kind of nascent projects, especially in Web3, or, everyone's saying it's not going to work?
I think my one bit of advice is I've got a couple bits of advice. So a lot of what you need to do to be successful as an entrepreneur, obviously there's all the kind of motivational porn stuff that you hear, like it is all about mindset and habits and who you surround yourself with. And, I'll tell you the greatest struggles, I think for me on a personal basis, have not really been questions of strategy or should I invest in this product versus that product. It's all people related. It's all how do I get people going and moving in the same direction? And, my view of my particular role at Blockworks has changed as Blockworks has grown as a company. But I think the primary role that every founder needs to be aware of is your job as a founder is to make people row in the same direction. You got to find a way to get people bought into your vision and all aligned towards the same thing. If you do that, not it, the rest will come. I promise the rest will come. But your primary job is actually to kind of be like a cheerleader and get people all aligned and doing their jobs, right, and doing the same thing. Um, I think when it comes to Web3 and crypto in particular, look, I just want to say, I mean, I'm a huge fan of this industry. The reason I'm so excited to be working in it is because I think this is going to be the biggest opportunity I'll probably ever see in my lifetime. A huge part of being a founder is you got to pick the right industry. And crypto, we were talking about how early it feels today. There are enormous tailwinds behind this industry. It is growing like crazy. And if you're out there listening to this and you don't work in the industry, but you're kind of looking at NFTs and Dogecoin and thinking, yeah, but isn't it all just really speculative and isn't it a bubble? One thing that might not be as obvious to folks who aren't working in the industry is the average level of talent and the human capital that's flowing into the industry, because it is really, really tremendous. There's just this energy that people have, and people are coming from super, super impressive backgrounds, like the largest hedge funds in the world, the most sophisticated tech platforms in the world. They're all leaving to build these things in Web3 and crypto. So what I would say is you got to pick the right industry. I think crypto is a really good one. That does not mean it's going to be all up and to the right. You will have good times and bad times and whatever. But as long as you can stick with it, hire good people and motivate them to do their jobs, then I think you'll have a pretty good shot at being successful.
Words from the wise. I love it. So where do you see Blockworks in the future? Do you have any key milestones you're planning to hit? What does the next 12 months look like?
Yeah. So over the next 12 months, I think a lot of it's just going to be continuing to do what we're doing, right? So we have 5 products now. We've got kind of our website, we've got podcasts, we've got conferences, webinars, and basically what we want to do is just continue to grow these things, 10x. And I think I'm super, super happy with the growth that we've had over the course of, let's say, the last 18 months. So we've gone from like 8 employees to 45 today. We think we'll be 80 by the end of the year. And we just want to keep executing on the vision at hand.
That's awesome. And just listening to your careful choice of words, you don't hire lightly. So the fact that you're ready to double in employees means you're doing awesome things. Are these events new? I see Permissionless coming up in Palm Beach, Florida. Can you talk a bit about your events? Maybe you want to plug something there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the Permissionless is the largest cultural and DeFi focused event in the world. We expect 7,500 people will be down there. And, we were talking about different lenses that you could understand crypto through. And one of the biggest lenses is this idea of decentralized finance, culture in the form of NFTs, and the metaverse, right? So you're kind of building this ability for people to transact and operate online in a way that is not governed by large tech platforms like Facebook. And what we're really seeing is this Cambrian explosion of all of these different ideas around property rights, art and culture, finance, and it's all happening in this decentralized way, essentially on the web, like Web3. So it's going to be really, really cool. It's 3 days of content. We've got big speakers. You can go check out our website. And there's going to be a lot of we're almost viewing it as a bit of a festival, right? There's a lot of parties, a lot of big DJs that are performing down there. So I think, if you're thinking about, if you want to learn more about this industry, if you want to celebrate the successes of the industry so far, I think it's a really good place both for people that are starting to get interested and they're like, wow, I've seen a lot about this, but I want to plug in more. I want to take that next step of actually meeting industry participants. So I think it's a really good space for them. And I also think if you've been operating in the space, I'm biased, so you should take this with a grain of salt. But like, I've been to a lot of crypto conferences. I have never been as excited as I am for permissionless. So I get it's great for the industry participants as well.
That's awesome. Sounds like an awesome time.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
So as we wrap up here, any final thoughts as we're closing? Any reflections on the last year or so?
Yeah, I think, heading into the next decade or so, and, all the challenges that we have in general, I think it's always important when you're just walking around interacting with people to remember that everyone is fighting an invisible battle, or a battle that's invisible to you. Vast majority of people out there are well-intentioned. And at the end of the day, relationships are the only thing that matters. So I, like everyone else, it's very easy to fall into this idea of like, my political views are the right ones. Everyone else is an idiot, or they're biased, or they're prejudiced, or whatever. I think it's just a really good reminder for everyone that we're all humans. We have way more in common with each other than differences, and to just try to be open-minded and accept people for what they are. I don't know. If you have that frame of mind, you'll obviously be wrong. There are not great people out there, but I think overall, for just everyone's mental health and like a personal world outlook, I think that's the right way to look at things.
I'm convinced mental health is everything, and beautiful words, really beautiful. But I got to say something before we let you go. I came across a tweet of yours, and were you actually an early investor with Theranos, or did you just get hold of that mug?
No, man.
Honestly,
Oh
it
my
cracked me
God.
up.
That's so funny. My co-founder Jason got that for me. He just saw that. He just saw that and thought it was funny.
The mic was on mute. I was just cracked. I was like, "There's no way this is for real. This is amazing. Just so, just too good."
Yeah. No, it's it is not real. That would be a pretty epic story. But I am not. Fortunately, I'm not an early investor in Theranos.
Thankfully, yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah, but I will wrap up and say it's okay to be wrong. So, if you're going to invest, if you're going to try new things, right? I'm sure you have your own stories of, things not working out. So, very insightful words. Loved the last chat in the last hour, and we will definitely follow along and hope to keep in touch.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me on.
You got it. Cheers. So with that said, let's wrap up today's episode. Thank you for listening to another episode of Methodical Millions, where you can better your future and better yourself.
Thanks, everyone.